Hi Kim, question. What would be the difference between the need to be right and wanting to challenge other people to raise their level of consciousness through the mind of Christ? Thank you. Okay, very interesting question. Let's first define what we're talking about. I have in many videos talked about the duality consciousness. And the duality consciousness is where you go into this illusion that you are a separate being. And you're using the duality consciousness to define who you are as a separate being. Among other things, you define what you believe. Let's say, for example, in duality, you are defining yourself, I'm a Christian. Or you're defining yourself, I'm a scientific materialist, I'm an atheist. So this is a definition you step into, you impose upon yourself. And what happens then is that because in duality there are always two polarities, your definition doesn't stand alone. So you are a Christian, you are threatened by atheists. You are an atheist, you are threatened by religious people. So there's constantly a tension. And as a result of that, you have a need to validate your dualistic viewpoint. You need to validate that you are right as a separate being and the others are wrong. So that's why you have Christians who are believing that the ultimate authority in the world is the Christian scriptures and their particular literal interpretation of the Christian scriptures, and therefore they have this ultimate authority proving that they are right and therefore the atheists are wrong. You have the scientific materialists who are saying that the ultimate authority in the world is scientific measurements, and scientific measurements have proven there's nothing beyond the material universe, therefore they are right and all the religious people are wrong. So you see what I'm saying? It's just a matter of where do you choose, what relative idea or viewpoint do you choose to elevate to the status of being absolute? This is the ultimate authority. And therefore, my viewpoint is, my sense of identity is validated, and I can put down or ignore those who oppose it. So this is the duality consciousness. Now, as I've also tried to explain in several videos, the Christ consciousness, or the one mind, is beyond this. It's beyond the dualistic polarities. It sees the underlying wonders of all life. And it also sees the difference between the one mind, the Christ mind, and the duality consciousness. So, in the Christ mind, you are seeing that people are trapped in duality. And they are suffering in duality. They can only suffer in duality. But here comes a very subtle distinction. It actually took me a long time to work out. Because I first heard about the idea of Christ consciousness in the late 1980s. In my second spiritual movement called the Summit Lighthouse, which was an Ascended Master organization that had dictations, messages from the Ascended Masters. And it talked a lot about Christhood. The goal of our personal path is to develop personal Christhood. But the way it was seen in the general culture, I'm not saying this is the way the Ascended Masters presented it, but the way it was seen in general culture was precisely as the question describes. The difference between the need to be right and wanting to challenge other people to raise their level of consciousness through the mind of Christ. So people thought that those who don't believe what we believe are wrong, and we need to challenge them to see that they are wrong. And this is part of our Christhood. In other words, people, including myself, thought that as we develop personal Christhood, we can see how other people are wrong, and therefore we need to challenge them to show them how they are wrong, so they can see the error of their ways and basically come to accept what we believe. And you know, you can define it in different ways. You can say that this isn't yet Christhood, or you can say it's the lower levels of Christhood. Because the thing is, in duality, everything is colored, everything is subjective, everything is biased. And everything is based on the separate mind. So as you start to develop Christhood, you start to have glimpses that there's a mind beyond the dualistic mind. And So most people who go through this, whether they're in this organization or that organization, they start to have these experiences where you have an experience, there's something outside your normal state of mind. It's what I've described in several videos. The conscious you steps outside your normal state of mind. It experiences a pure or neutral awareness, which is basically the Christ mind, which is neutral compared to duality, which is always biased. So we have genuine experiences, but they just last a short time. Then we go back in our normal state of consciousness. And now the big challenge is, this is actually one of the challenges of Christ, the second challenge of Christ is, do we use our genuine experience of the Christ mind to validate a viewpoint or a belief that is actually based on duality and separation? Such as, we are the only ones who have the truth. Our spiritual movement is the highest spiritual movement. We have the highest truth. Therefore, everybody should become converted to our spiritual movement. You see, you can have a genuine experience, but you can use it to validate a viewpoint that comes from the separate mind. And now what you will do if you do this, you will engage with other people. And your goal is to prove them wrong, that their beliefs or their spiritual movement or their religious movement is wrong. Because you think that if you can prove them wrong, they will be converted to follow your movement. And you are convinced that this is actually doing the work of Christ. You are coming from the Christ mind seeking to enlighten these people to the error of their ways by proving their viewpoints wrong. I did the same thing. You know, I'm not in any way trying to say that I was smarter than this. I fell right into this same trap, and I was in it for quite some years. And I've seen many other people go into it, both in Summit Lighthouse and other spiritual movements. It's a very common syndrome. And it's, in a way, an inevitable syndrome. I'm not trying to put people down for this and say this is wrong. What else can we do? We go through, and I've said this before, there's a certain phase of the spiritual path which is almost schizophrenic, because we are in between two worlds. We experience there's a spiritual world beyond the material. There's a state of consciousness beyond the dualistic state of consciousness, but we still have a foot in each camp. You know, or maybe we just once in a while stick a hand out in the non-dual view, and then we are right back in the soup. So we are in between. We're sitting between two chairs. And we have to try and find our way to work through that schizophrenic phase until we get through it, and we are now more anchored in the Christ mind. And we do this by, as I've explained, resolving these subconscious selves that are pulling us back into duality. And we do this one by one until there's not so much of a pull, and then we are more anchored in the Christ mind. And in the Christ mind, you're not trying to prove people wrong in order to put them down. You're not trying to validate your own viewpoint. As I said, in duality, you're always looking for validation because you constantly feel threatened by different viewpoints. So you are, in a sense, you're basically thinking that when you attain the Christ mind, it will be the ultimate validation of what you believe right now. This is what you think in the beginning. I did exactly the same thing. And then only when you go to a higher level of grasping what the Christ mind is, you realize it's really not a matter of right and wrong. Right and wrong are dualistic concepts. It's a polarity, right and wrong. But you can't have a polarity in the one mind. Right? You can't. Then it's not the one mind. It's not an undivided mind if there's a polarity. Now take care here. The duality consciousness will try to pull everything into duality. So it will try to say, okay, you're talking about the Christ mind. Well, it's obviously the opposite of the Antichrist mind. And in a sense you could say that the one mind is different from the divided mind, yes, but it's not in opposition to it. The Christ mind doesn't see itself as in opposition to the duality mind or to the mind of Antichrist, because the Christ mind sees oneness behind everything. So the Christ mind sees that behind even the mind of Antichrist is still oneness. Nothing is in reality separated from oneness. It's just existing in a temporary bubble in oneness because of free will. And the separation is only in people's minds. So the Christ mind, at some point you realize nothing can really oppose it. There's no opposition to oneness. And so all of a sudden, two things happen. First of all, you don't need to be validated in the outer. You don't need to have a specific outer viewpoint validated. And you especially don't need to engage in this process of validating as a dualistic viewpoint by proving another dualistic viewpoint wrong. As you become more anchored in the Christ mind, you see the futility of this. You see the vanity of this. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity in these dualistic arguments that never lead anywhere. So you shift. You're not trying to prove other people wrong because you have a need to validate yourself. First of all, you overcome the need to validate yourself. So you're not approaching other people seeking validation because you have your validation from within. As you become more anchored in the Christ mind, you don't need validation from the world because you're getting validation from within by experiencing your higher self and your spiritual teachers. And then you realize that in many cases it isn't really constructive to prove other people's viewpoints wrong because it's not going to help them escape duality necessarily. And converting people to a specific spiritual movement is not going to help them escape duality either. So in other words, while you are still in that interim phase, you are thinking, I found this spiritual movement. It helped me see that there were all these lies in the world. It helped me see a higher truth. Therefore, the solution to all of mankind's problems is that all other people go through the same conversion experience that I went through. That's what you're thinking in this interim stage. That's why you go into this trying to prove that other people's spiritual movement is wrong, that yours is superior. When you become anchored in the Christ mind, you realize the goal is really not to convert everybody to a specific spiritual movement. The ultimate goal is really to help everybody escape duality. But even so, people are at different levels of consciousness. And the goal of the Christ mind is not to take people to the ultimate level of consciousness in one giant leap. The goal of the Christ mind, and that's what Jesus demonstrated as he went out into the world and met people wherever they were at, the goal of the Christ mind is to meet people where they're at and give them what they need to come up higher. There's a concept that Jesus meets a man who's thirsty, and instead of giving him a spiritual teaching, he gives him a cup of cold water. Because that's what he needed at the time. So the Christ mind doesn't say, oh, you have to come up and accept this ultimate belief. The Christ mind looks at a specific person and gives that person something that could take them to the next step up. Then maybe later you can give them something else to go. But you see what I'm saying? It's not a goal to get people up here instantly. Its goal is to get them started on the process of gradually growing, transcending themselves. And when you get to that point, you are seeking to help people raise their consciousness. Now, in some cases, this might mean that you will challenge some of their beliefs. But in other cases, it might mean something entirely different. In some cases, you might need to show them unconditional love. Accept them for who they are, because that's what they need. So you see, when you're in the interim phase, you are thinking, oh, this is how the Christ is, and this is what the Christ does. Jesus challenged the scribes and Pharisees. So you always go out and challenge people. I have met people who were into this big time. They thought they had to challenge everybody, and this was the Christ mind. But it isn't. You may challenge people. Jesus did challenge the scribes and Pharisees. But other times, he was kind to other people. And so suddenly it becomes an individual thing. Instead of deciding with the outer mind, this is how the Christ always behaves, the Christ decides on an individual basis. You're meeting a person at a certain level. You're not even really deciding with the outer mind. It just comes to you. What does that person need? What do you need in order to help that person? And in many cases, it isn't challenging them. It can be, in many cases, when I meet people, they need somebody who will listen to them. They just need to be listened to, and then they need to feel that you accept them for who they are. So it's not always the right approach to challenge them. Now sometimes you can talk to people, you can listen to them, you can make them feel accepted, and then you can maybe ask a couple of questions that helps them see something they didn't see before. But this is not the same as going out there challenging them. You are wrong, this is wrong, you are an illusion. Now I remember back to this, and there were so many people, myself included, we had this dream that you can come up with this ultimate argument. And that if the Christ mind sees the ultimate truth, the Christ mind should be able to come up with this ultimate argument that will convince everybody how wrong they are. And this is simply a perverted power. It's a power game, and it's an ego game. The ego wants to have the power to convert everybody, to validate its viewpoints and make it seem right. And I've seen so many people, and myself included, using spiritual teachings to try and do this. But this isn't the Christ mind. Many people think it is, but it isn't. It's just an ego game. And when you see that, and when you shed it, then you take a step closer to actual Christhood, where there is no evaluation, there's no standard, there's no definition of how the Christ mind should be. You are acting individually in a certain situation. And again, I'm not trying to say that the Christ mind is some ultimate state of mind, because, I've talked about this 144 levels of consciousness. And below the 48th level, people see themselves as separate beings. Between the 48th and the 96th, that's what I call the interim phase. We're walking the spiritual path, we're pulling ourselves above the mass consciousness. But then the crucial turning point is at the 96th level, and the turning point there is, do we actually grasp what the Christ mind is about? Because as I've explained, when you are walking from the 48th to the 96th, you're actually building a spiritual self, a spiritual sense of identity. And this is necessary in order to pull yourself above the collective consciousness, which otherwise would pull you into being like everybody else. So you do, at this lower stages, you are building this separate self. But then at the 96th level, you have to make that switch and realize this was just a vehicle to get you to the 96th level of consciousness. And now you're starting to go into the levels of Christhood. But this is not about perfecting that separate self and giving it ultimate power. It's about letting go of it, overcoming all sense of separate self in the world, where you are uniting with your higher self. And if you don't make that switch, that's when you go into trying to use a spiritual teaching to validate yourself by proving other people wrong. You think you're doing this to awaken them, but it's just a game you're playing. And it's like this old saying, if the only tool you have is a hammer, you think every problem is a nail. So power, 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 proving other people wrong. And there are people, I've seen people who think that this is Christhood. And as I said, that's just it's a blind alley you can go into. But I've also seen people get out of it again after some time, where they realize that, oh, there's actually a much higher view of Christhood than this. And so I hope this has clarified the question. Let me just take a look at the question again. The difference between the need to be right and wanting to challenge other people to raise their level of consciousness through the mind of Christ. So the Christ doesn't want to be right. It does not want to be right compared to other people who are wrong. The Christ is beyond right and wrong. That's why it's the one mind. So in the Christ mind, you're only seeking to raise people up. And sometimes that might mean challenging if they have some beliefs that pull them away from, that pull them down to a lower state of consciousness. Of course, you, as the Christ, you need to challenge people's dualistic beliefs. But you're not doing it for the purpose of proving them wrong. See, this is another crucial difference. When you're in a state of separation, you see yourself as a separate being, threatened by other separate beings. And how do you prove yourself right? By proving them wrong. You are right, they are wrong. But see, in the Christ mind, that fades away, that just disappears. You don't need to prove yourself right. because you're experiencing you are one with the one mind. And therefore, you're not trying to put other people down. You're trying to raise them up. You're trying to free them so they become right with God in the one mind. You see what I'm saying? Is instead of trying to put people down, which is what the ego does, you're trying to raise people up. So you may challenge some of their beliefs, but it's not to prove them wrong. It's to free them from these beliefs that keep them trapped in separation. And it's a fundamental difference. It's a fundamental difference. Which, it's not a theory, it's not something you believe. It just becomes an experience. That you are not threatened by other people. And, you know, you also have to come to this point where you accept free will for what it is. And, you know, this was another puzzle that really took me years to deal with, because it's so easy to go into this, but it has to be something that's true. There has to be a truth. Right? So you're thinking, the Christ mind is the ultimate truth. Everything is oneness. So you're thinking that in every situation, the Christ mind should be able to come up with the ultimate truth, the ultimate argument. But you see, in most situations where there's conflicts between people, they have dualistic viewpoints. And in duality, as I've tried to explain in my non-duality videos, there is no ultimate right or wrong. There's no ultimate argument. Because in duality, you can prove or disprove anything by ignoring evidence. So it's not that the Christ mind is able to come up with an ultimate argument that will convince people in duality that they're wrong, because it can't be done. So what the Christ mind does is seeks to demonstrate to people there's an alternative to this state of mind where everything is seen in terms of right and wrong. That's what the Christ mind is about. And that's why you have to come to a point where you can accept that even the Christ mind can't reach everybody. And therefore, you don't have to think that you have to come up with some ultimate argument that can convert everybody. This kept me trapped for years. I was thinking, but there must be some ultimate argument. You could argue that I'm still affected by this, hoping that when I talk about non-duality, for example, I can come up with some ultimate reasoning process that will convince everybody what non-duality really is and isn't. Perhaps. But at least I've come to a point where I accept that it is not my responsibility to convert or convince everybody. There will be people that I can't convince. I can't reach them. And you see Jesus. He challenged the scribes and Pharisees, yes, but he didn't go into arguing with them. They had sophisticated arguments based on the Jewish scriptures. And in many cases, he didn't argue with them. What did he often do? He said, "Scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites." So he challenged them, but not with this sophisticated reasoning process. And I came to a point where I had to recognize that I had a separate self that thought I should be able to come up with the ultimate argument. And I had to realize it was complete nonsense, because it isn't possible in duality to come up with an ultimate argument. And when you see that and let that self die, then you are free. You can say, okay, I can just be who I am. I can just express the level of Christhood that I've attained so far, wherever I'm at on the scale of the 144 levels of consciousness. All I can do is express that. And if it isn't the ultimate, well, that's just what it is. I have to be where I'm at. I have to express myself based on my current level of consciousness. And therefore I have to accept I can't reach everybody. I'm not meant to reach everybody. It's not my responsibility to reach everybody. I can only be who I am. And in a sense, you know, for me at least, it came to a point where after having gone through a phase where I thought it was my responsibility to convince everybody, I now realize it's not my responsibility to convince anybody. I can only really express myself at my present level of consciousness and hope that that helps some people. But if I have an intent or convincing or converting other people, in that intent, this isn't the full Christhood. Because in Christhood, there really is no intent other than demonstrating the alternative and letting people do with that whatever they want. That's why Jesus allowed himself to be crucified. Jesus being physically crucified is really a symbol for the Christ consciousness, the consciousness of oneness, being crucified by the mind of separation, the duality consciousness. Because the Christ is crucified, fixated on this cross with four corners, vertical, horizontal, by the duality consciousness, and the four corners represent our four lower bodies, the identity body, the mental body, the emotional body, and the physical body. The four corners of the universe. And the duality consciousness crucifies the mind of Christ. But still, the mind of Christ can enter this world, can demonstrate that there's an alternative. And that's all we can do as we put on Christhood. Demonstrate there's an alternative to the duality consciousness, to the separate mind. And then we can hope that by seeing that example, people will then take Christ off the cross in their own beings, and they will realize that they also have access to the Christ mind within themselves. You could say, basically, what's the role of the Christ? You can talk about there's a universal Christ mind, which is the mind of oneness. And there is the living Christ, the embodied Christ. I mean, why is it important that Jesus took incarnation, physical incarnation? Because it demonstrates that a person who is in a physical body on earth can reach a level of Christhood by unifying with the Christ mind, with the one mind. And by demonstrating this, people can see, oh, if he could do it, I could do it. This is the motto of the Ascended Masters. What one has done, all can do. And what is the greatest perversion in Christianity is that they destroyed Jesus as an example and elevated him to being the exception, the only Son of God. But anybody who attains a certain level of Christhood is a son or daughter of God, becomes a son or daughter of God. It's even talked about in some of the teachings in the book of Acts and Paul's letters. You can become sons of God. And so this is what it means. And really what we are here to demonstrate is the Christ mind can express itself through me, to show you there's an alternative to your current state of consciousness. And in the beginning, the first challenge of Christ is to recognize the Christ, that there's something special. Here's a person who has something I don't have. The second challenge of Christ is to experience Christ for yourself and not use it to validate your separate views, your separate sense of identity, to prove that you're right, that your dualistic viewpoints are right. That's the second challenge, to avoid that. That's the challenge that Peter didn't pass in the situation where Jesus is asking his disciples, who do ye say that I am? And Peter says, you are the living Christ. And he says, blessed art thou, because flesh and blood hasn't revealed this to you. Because only the Christ mind can reveal this to you. So Peter had recognized the Christ. But then he's in the passage right after, Jesus is telling his disciples he's going to go to Jerusalem and be crucified and killed. And Peter says, oh, that is not going to happen to you. Because in Peter's mind, that's not how the Christ is meant to be treated in the world. And what does Jesus say to him? He says, get thee behind me, Satan. Because Peter is trying to take the Christ and use it to validate his views based on the mind of Antichrist. And this is the satanic consciousness that does this. So that's the second challenge of Christ. The third challenge of Christ is that you actually come, instead of just seeing the Christ in one person, you come to see the Christ in yourself. And you accept that you have the potential to become the living Christ. And the fourth challenge of Christ is then that you go out and demonstrate that to others so that you become the living Christ, as you saw in, for example, Jesus or other spiritual gurus throughout the ages, because many people have demonstrated this. Many people have attained some degree of Christhood. There are many people in today that are valid teachers and gurus because they have some degree of Christhood. Now, it's another matter whether they've attained the ultimate, because what is the ultimate? That's a whole other discussion. But so these are the 4 challenges of Christ. And when you see this, you get to that point where you're just, you see that all you can really do is be yourself, express whatever level of Christhood you have right now, and leave it up to people what they do with this, whether they do anything with it. But you see, your responsibility is to express the Christ light. What people do with it is not your responsibility. That's their responsibility.